Today I want to talk to you about organization higher purpose and how it impacts performance in organizations and why we should all care about it. So this is based on some research that I've been doing with a former colleague of mine in organization behavior from University of Michigan. This is what happens when finance professors talk to OB professors, and you get stuff that is so far removed from the world of finance that I can't even share this with my finance colleagues. They lose interest really fast. But anyway, so this is work we've been doing for the last 3 years or so, collecting data, analyzing it, interviewing leaders in organizations. And as Mark mentioned, we published this article in the Harvard Business Review. It was on the cover of the July-August issue. And the title of the article was Creating a Purpose-Driven Organization. And the theme of the article was to discuss what organizational higher purpose is and how it impacts performance. Okay, so I want to share some of those ideas with you. Now, the first question that I get when I talk to people about purpose or higher purpose is, what exactly do you mean? And people want to know how it's different from mission or vision and all of the terms that people are more familiar with. So let me just define the term for you, and then I'll share some case studies or anecdotes to illustrate the ideas. So for an organization, when we talk about higher purpose, it's really a pro-social contribution goal, something that transcends the usual business goals. But what we're interested in is the intersection of that higher purpose with your business goals. So the idea is that your purpose becomes the arbitrator of all of your business decisions. So it's not charity, it's something deeply connected with your business. And I'll give you some examples of how different organizations define this in different ways. Now, for an individual, it really is the expression of your highest intent. It's connected to the deepest dimension within you. It's about who you are, where you came from, but most importantly, where you're going. Okay? And I have a lot of examples. I don't have enough time to share all the interesting stories with you, so I'll share one. And this is about how when an individual has a sense of higher purpose that's connected to the business of the organization that they work for, how it impacts their behavior in really shocking, unexpected ways. So this is a story about a couple that was celebrating their wedding anniversary, and they decided to spend 3 days at a very expensive resort. It's an inn in Washington, Virginia. And so they drive up to the inn, and as they're checking in, the wife turns to the husband and says, "Honey, would you run to the car and get my hanging garment bag?" Because that's where all the clothes were. And so the husband says, "Sure." So he runs to the car. And a few minutes later, he comes back with this horrified look on his face. There was no garment bag. So she had apparently left it in the garage next to the car, thinking he would put it in the car, and he forgot. And so, of course, the wife was really distraught, very unhappy. And, you know, I don't know about you, but in my case, when my wife is unhappy, it's almost invariably the case that I end up being even more unhappy. And so the poor husband didn't know what to do. And while this was going on, one of the employees at the inn came up to him and said, "Why don't you give me your home address and the keys to your house?" And so he said, fine. He didn't even realize what he was doing. And it took the couple 2 hours before they realized that this man was was on his way to Pittsburgh, which is where the couple was from. And he returned. He drove 8 hours that day and came back just before dinner with her garment bag with all the clothes. So the question is, how in an organization do you get people to do this? How do you get them to exceed performance expectations to this extent where they do things that are truly shocking? And that is what purpose does, because it shapes culture, it changes the way that people connect with the organization, and that's what we found in our research. Now, different organizations define culture in different ways, right? So you can either define it as something that is very customer-centric. You can define it as something that is very employee-centric, or you can just define it as a pro-social contribution goal for society. So I'll give you some examples. Customer-centric. So one of the more interesting examples that we came across was the Development Bank of Singapore, where they engaged in this exercise to discover purpose. Now, one of the interesting things that Bob and I found in our research is you don't invent purpose, you discover it. And it's always there. It's embedded in the organization, and different organizations go through different processes to discover this purpose. So in this case, the purpose that they came up with was making banking joyful. At first, it was discarded as being too hokey. What do you mean? How can banking be joyful? And then they kept going round and round and eventually settled on that. And then that led to a whole series of actions. They completely redesigned the executive floor of their headquarters building to reflect the new purpose. They designed new customer apps that reflected the joyfulness of banking. They did all kinds of things that banks don't normally do. I mean, I study banks, and so I know. And so, and then on Chinese New Year's Day, it's customary for people to go to banks and exchange old money for new money. And that obviously causes a lot of trouble because there are long lines at banks and it's inconvenient. And so their employees came up with this idea that they would have mobile ATMs and just flood the market with these so people wouldn't have to stand in long lines and it'd be more fun. And so this was such a big hit that one of the local TV stations, and the customers were so happy that one of the local TV stations decided to interview the CEO and said, that's a great idea. How did you come up with it? The truth of the matter was the CEO had no clue this was going on, but he politely accepted the compliments. And then he called in his CIO and said, why didn't you tell me about this? And the CIO says, well, if we're going to make banking joyful, we can't have you involved in every small decision, can we? So my second example is about being employee-centric. The lead company in our Harvard Business Review article is a company called DTE Energy. And so we interviewed Jerry Anderson, the CEO. And he told us a story about how in 2008, they were in deep financial trouble like a lot of other companies. And he says people were telling him that they were going to be the first junk bond utility. And so he said he tried all the usual stuff, the stuff that we teach in MBA programs. He tightened performance metrics, increased control, more monitoring, set stretch targets. And he said all of that helped a little bit, but not enough. And in fact, the stretch targets ended up scaring people in the organization because they created more uncertainty. And so he called his executive team and said, you have 10 days to come up with a plan to save this company. And he says 2 days later, they walked in and said, Jerry, too much money has walked out the door. And the only way to save the company is to shut down some plants and lay off people. And Jerry said he knew that he was faced with the biggest, toughest decision of his professional life. And he said, what I wanted my people to give me was their discretionary energy, like the little inn in Washington, Virginia. And how would they do that if I was going to abandon them in their time of greatest need? So he said, I decided after some reflection to go in exactly the opposite direction. And so he said, I called my employees in. He said, we had over 10,000 employees. And he said, we're in deep trouble. But I'm here to tell you that absolutely the last lever that I will pull to preserve the integrity of this organization is layoffs. But in exchange, I need something from you. And I want you to give me every ounce of creative energy that you have to save this company. And then he said he didn't really believe in the power of purpose. But what he saw after this was astonishing, because quarter after quarter, the results, financial results are coming in and they're beating plan. Every single time, every variance is positive. So he called in his CFO and he said, I almost yelled at him and said, your financial system is broken. There's something wrong here. These numbers can't be right. And he says, the CFO almost yelled back and said, Jerry, nothing is broken. This is what's happening. Now, there's a fascinating, I don't have time to go over all of the little things that happened within the organization, but Jerry says it was hard for him to see because it was so decentralized. It was happening in thousands of places all over the company, but it was aggregating up to this remarkable performance. So that's sort of an example of an employee-centric higher purpose. And then my last example that I'll share with you is it can be very explicitly pro-social. There are a lot of examples that we have that we studied, but one that stood out for me, and it's not even on this list, is a few years back I was introduced to this show called Shark Tank. You guys see it? Okay. I wish that had never happened, because if you've ever seen that show, and especially if you're a finance person like me, it's addictive, right? I mean, I just love the way they make up valuations on the fly with no spreadsheets, you know. And, but anyway, so I saw one of these shows, and some of you may have seen this one. And the show was about this farmer from Florida called Johnny Georges. And he was really motivated, so he came to the Sharks for money. And he was motivated by the fact that when you irrigate these fields and you have sprinklers, a lot of water is wasted. And in fact, his pitch was that only 10% of the water from the sprinkler actually irrigates that part of the field that you want to irrigate. The rest is just sort of sprays all over the place. So he had invented something called a tree teepee, okay, and this is like plastic cover. And he said it basically cut water consumption to like 10% of what it normally is. And he was really motivated by preserving the environment and water conservation. And he wanted to share this with other farmers, so he wanted to create a business out of this. So he comes to the Sharks and he makes his pitch. And so as usual, they asked him, how much does it cost? What do you sell it for? And so he said, well, it cost me about $3, and I sell it for a little over $4, so make $1 per teepee. And so one of the Sharks said, this is crazy. He said, you should be charging $12 or $15. Why not? And because they'll buy it. It's so good. And his response was, but I'm selling to farmers. You know, I can't gouge them. You know, they're just like me. So it's enough that I make $1 per teepee. And so one after the other, the Sharks said no, because there's no room for a distributor. There's not enough margin for a distributor to come in and also make money, and you can't scale this business up without a distributor. And Johnny kept saying no. And one after the other, the Sharks kept saying, no, I'm out, I'm out, I'm out. And finally, one Shark stood up and said, Johnny, I believe in everything you're doing. This is the right purpose. This is the right reason to have this business. I'll give you the money for the ownership that you've asked for, no negotiation. The only thing I ask for is, okay, we won't charge $15 a teepee, but if we can do $7, then we can make this economically viable, and we can still serve this higher purpose. So the point of sharing this story is it's motivated by an entrepreneur who has pro-social goals in mind in setting up the business. He really wants to conserve water. He wants to help fellow farmers. But it cannot be a charity. So pursuing a higher purpose is not charity. You still have to have a financially viable business. And some of the companies that we've studied that have been very successful in implementing higher purpose effectively have actually had high margins. You know, they have high margins in their business. But it's really key that whatever higher purpose you come up with, it has to be authentic. So I guess for me, the two biggest learnings from this research were it has to be authentic, and it's discovered, it's not invented. So, you know, we had limited space in the HBR article, so Bob and I decided that we'd flesh these ideas out and share tools and more anecdotes and case studies. So we have a book that's coming out in July of next year with Barrett Kohler, where we talk about the 8 steps in the HBR article, and each step is a chapter in the book with tools and case studies to make these concepts come alive. So, you know, I haven't had enough time to fully explain what this means, but hopefully I've given you enough to at least stimulate your interest in the topic. So thank you for your attention.